Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in AP English, and we turn now in our study of the World of Ideas text to lecture number 9, the great Frederick Douglass, and the text Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. This is the first of our readings from the Unit 2 collection of 4 titles on justice. Now, studying Frederick Douglass is such an important part of the experience of 303 over the years. I remember vividly a student who came in and said, "Man, I hate school. I hate it so badly." And I said, "So you like being a slave? What are you talking about? Did you not hear what I just said? I hate school. School is the place where you're a slave." And I said, let's read Frederick Douglass together, and let's hear his argument on what true slavery is. There is the slavery of the mind. There is the bondage of the there is the slavery of the mind and the bondage of the body. The slavery of the body is self-evidently slavery. Douglass will make the argument, though, that the slavery of the mind is far more profound, and education is the only way to gain emancipation. Let's hear what he has to say. Now, we do have some assumptions as we always begin these lectures. Our first is that you've been following our previous 8 lectures, the World of Ideas lectures at learnstrong.net. If you haven't, we hope that you hit that. Go to the AP folder and find our lectures, especially Lecture 8, which was the introduction to Unit number 2 and to the topic of justice. Here, we're going to hear more about what injustice is than what justice is, but I think it's an important observation for us to at least build on earlier ideas. The other assumption is that earlier lectures on Frederick Douglass that I've already given and are available at learnstrong.net, you can do the search there and find those, have also been watched in the junior folder, especially where we've given a full lecture on Frederick Douglass. My assumption in giving this lecture is that you have already seen, studied, and flowed that lecture, and if you haven't, then you clearly want to make sure that you do that. The other assumptions are learning theory, that desire to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways, especially through our annotative process. Remember, we're working with paragraph summarization. So at each paragraph, we're writing down 2 or 3 things, bullet pointing at level 1. What does the text say? That's going to be significant for us. And then, of course, we'll be working at level 2. What does this text mean in some way? And especially our big 5, as we refer to it. What does this text tell us about epistemology and what one can know? Ontology and who one is. Psychology, the study of the individual mind. Sociology, the study of the collective group mind. And finally, theodicy, the question of, and this is a big one for a text like this, why is it the case that there is suffering in the world? And to what degree can we somehow deal with that suffering? Finally, at level 3, we'll be asking at 3, how can I relate this information to other texts I already know? And then finally, how can I relate it to myself? Back to level 2 for a second, just to remind. At 2B, we'll be paying very close attention to the rhetorical techniques here of Douglass, especially as it relates to this notion of the narrative, because we're all going to have to write these narratives as we come through school. These stories that have influential meaning in our life, and we'll study the way Douglass will do this brilliantly. Now, even though I've talked about Douglass in earlier lectures and I've given quite a bit of biography, let's just hit the high points here. The dates, no question, put it in your notes. Douglass is one of the greatest American heroes. If you're going to study great Americans, Douglass has to be in your top 5, I argue. In your top 5 as a student. Born 1817, dies 1895. Interestingly, he dies after recently attending a women's suffrage movement. So there's a meeting for that movement. So Douglass was involved and encouraged the movements of his day. He is born into slavery in Maryland. He will, through Mrs. Hugh Auld, that's his owner's wife, who is a Northerner, he will learn to read and to write, although ironically it's going to be her husband who will say it's unlawful, it's unsafe, as we have said in other lectures. When we ask the theodictic question, how can you explain slavery in the Deep South and of course in the North as well in America? Well, those slaveholders didn't really think of those people as truly human. Here's the problem with that. There weren't any laws in Alabama. against teaching your mule to read. You think about that. Because if a slave and a mule were equal, then why do we have to have laws against teaching slaves to read, to write, to be educated? We'll get to this idea about what true slavery actually is. And for Douglas, this is an important point. The slavery of the body is nothing compared to the slavery of the mind. Well, let's say a few things about this narrative real quickly. It's going to be filled with all kinds of examples of injustice of slavery. Douglas himself was brutalized even by a professional slave breaker, as they're often referred to. Some of the passages of Douglas's narrative are not only disheartening, they're just downright obscene. And yet, I think they're profound in their delivery. No question, they should be read. There are, of course, some key laws that Douglas had to deal with. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 and then the Second Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, with the stiff penalties for anyone who would harbor an emancipated slave or a freed or an escaped slave. The Underground Railroad, all of that would, of course, in the end, force the North to begin to enact personal freedom laws, which ultimately is one of the cardinal reasons that the South will finally secede from the Union. Douglas ultimately will escape in 1838. He impersonates an African-American seaman and gets onto a ship, and then he ultimately changes his name to Douglas. He begins his career as an orator in 1841 at an anti-slavery meeting in Nantucket, and then he will take a 2-year speaking tour to Great Britain, 1845 to 1847. This was pivotal for a number of reasons, not least of which he began to be treated as a real human being, and that was a powerful moment for him. He comes back to the U.S., he buys his freedom, and he rises to fame. He convinces Lincoln of the significance of the abolitionist movement. He's the founder and the editor of the North Star, an abolitionist paper that's published in Rochester, New York. Ultimately, Lincoln, of course, will write and publish the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, as we have spoken about in other lectures. After the war, Douglas then will work in several capacities for government, especially the U.S. Minister to Haiti from 1889 to 1891. He is the first African American to reach national influence and fame. No question about his significance in the history of American thought and, of course, rhetoric. Speaking of rhetoric, let's talk a little bit about some of the techniques that we'll want to observe in our study here. We're only reading from the narrative chapters 6, 7, and 8, okay? So we're going into just a small part of the reading. I hope, as we have said about any number of other titles, where we are simply drawing out a selection, is that you will go and then read the entire text online or elsewhere. I think it's significant that as a student, you want to make sure you've read this text. It's a powerful one for you to add to your library. What are we going to say about rhetorical techniques? Well, first of all, it's a narrative, but we're going to say it's incredibly clear. It's a distinct style. The first-person narrative is simple, but it's also powerful. The structure is, write it in your notes, chronological narrative. In other words, we're going to be in the very earliest, and we're going to follow it along. Now, jot down in your notes why that can be significant. Clearly a coming-of-age, no question, a coming-of-age story. As we have used that term, Bildungsroman, in other lectures, we're going to actually see something very similar here. No question, in the same way that Telemachus has to go through his challenges, in the same way that Stephen Dedalus, in Portrait of the Artist, James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist, has to go through his challenges to become who he is and what he is, we're going to see something very, very similar in this narrative. Douglas, interestingly, doesn't interrupt himself with flashbacks or attempts to leap forward. The chronology is then very, very well paced. He will slow the narrative down at times to let the reader infer, especially issues of injustice, but he will seem very formal, almost unemotional in the descriptions of some of the horrific things that happen. We might ask why that would be the case, and one of the obvious answers is he doesn't want to come across as sentimental or emotional. This happened. The reader has to accept that this happened. And then the reader has to, of course, deal with it in the same ways that Douglas had to deal with it. There isn't a pity party here, and this is profound in our study. There isn't a, oh, I'm so beleaguered, it's so terrible, these things. None of that tone is here. Rather, let me tell you what happened. Let me tell you how I succeeded to get through it, how I struggled to get through it. He does use longer sentences and longer paragraphing, but provides lots of examples, and in that regards, descriptions are powerful in this text. Now, let's work level 1. I wish I could read all of this with you. I'm only going to read just a few lines out of this. I wish I could read it all. I just don't have the time. But let's go ahead now and work through it quickly. Paragraphs 1 and 2, he says, "My new mistress was a kind woman who had never owned slaves before, but the term dehumanizing effects of slavery," end quote, caught up with her, changed her quickly from warm and decent to harsh and unjust. So you want to put this in your notes right away. In our reading here, we get to witness the evolution or the de-evolution of a person who goes from being very warm and loving and compassionate to being harsh and cruel and ultimately, of course, unjust. Paragraph 3, Mrs. Auld, we're told, started to teach me how to spell, he says. But her husband made her stop because it was illegal to teach a slave to read. Mr. Auld's explanation that learning would make a slave, quote, unfit to be a slave, end quote, he says, made me understand that learning to read was a crucial first step toward gaining my freedom. Paragraph number 3 of this reading makes the argument that if you are going to be free, you have to be free in your mind. And one of the pivotal ways that happens is to learn how to read. I think this is one of the important essays of all the essays we study at AP that makes the argument that education is a propedeutic. It is life-altering. It's didactic. It's instructional. Go back to our comments on Plato's Republic and, of course, more particularly Book 7 in the cave allegory, that emancipation from the cave. We'll get to that actually in another part of the World of Ideas text. Paragraph number 4. In general, Douglas will say, city slaveholders, such as the Aulds, treated their slaves far better than plantation slaveholders. But Mrs. Hamilton, who lived on our street, he says, whipped her slaves mercilessly and also grossly underfed them. In paragraphs 5 through 8, he tells about his life with the Aulds. He says, I taught myself to read and write. Put it in your notes. We'll learn 2 important things from Douglas about education. One is the power of being self-taught, right? If you're in a math class and the math teacher isn't teaching you math and there's a textbook, you have no excuse not to learn mathematics. There are ways to do that, to be self-taught. Of course, living in the age that we live in with YouTube and any number of other online opportunities, there are no excuses to not be self-taught. If you want to learn something, Douglas argues, there is a way to do that. And, of course, the other argument that he will make about education, as we will get to it here, is lifelong learning. Never stop learning, no matter what happens in your life. He continues, he says, though my mistress was initially helpful, she soon refused to let me see the newspaper to make sure I couldn't educate myself in any way. Still, he says it, I learned to read by befriending hungry white boys. I traded them bread for reading lessons. In other words, more important than food of the body was food for the mind, and he would find any way to get it. That student who I was referencing at the beginning of our lecture, he had to admit, you know, I never really thought about school as something I really needed to help me free myself. I thought of school as the prison. I didn't think of school as the means of emancipation. But as I read the narrative, and my student went on to read all of the narrative of Douglas, and he just couldn't believe what Douglas put up with. It gave him a whole new insight into what it means to struggle for freedom, true freedom, intellectual and not just physical freedom. Paragraphs 9 through 10 of this reading are in many ways the heart, of course, of the reading. He says when he was 12, he came across the Columbian Orator, a book including dialogues and speeches denouncing slavery as morally wrong and arguing for emancipation. The abolitionist movement is in many ways born in this moment in his mind. He says, the book gave me the language for ideas I had been previously unable to articulate, but it also gave me cause to hate my enslavers more and more. And then he points it out that his master had been right. Let's go ahead and I'm reading now on page 114. He says it this way: as I read and contemplated the subject, behold, the subject of slavery, behold, that very discontentment which Master Hugh had predicted would follow my learning to read had already come, to torment and sting my soul to unutterable anguish. As I writhed under it, I would at times feel that learning to read had been a curse rather than a blessing. It had given me a view of my wretched condition without the remedy. It opened my eyes to the horrible pit, but to no ladder upon which to get out. Go back to this notion of the ladder and immediately think of our Dante and of course the Inferno. Up on your feet, this is no time to tire, from Canto 24. Go back and take a look at learnstrong.net in our AP folder to be reminded of that lecture. He says, in moments of agony, I envied my fellow slaves for their stupidity. I have often wished myself a beast. I preferred the condition of the meanest reptile to my own. Anything, no matter what, to get rid of thinking. It was this everlasting thinking of my condition that tormented me. And back to my student, he had to admit when he read these lines, it hadn't occurred to him. All my life in school, I've hated school. I never realized that what I hated was not school. It was slavery. And it had never occurred to me that schooling was the way to emancipate myself. But just learning in and of itself is going to often be a conduit to more pain, to more suffering. To recognize you're in a position of slavery is only, of course, more debilitating, more pain, more suffering. He continues, he says, there was no getting rid of it. It was pressed upon me by every object within sight or hearing, animate and inanimate. The silver trump of freedom had roused my soul to eternal wakefulness. Freedom now appeared to disappear no more forever. It was heard in every sound and seen in everything. This is, to me, prose poetry. It's beautiful writing. It was ever present to torment me with a sense of my wretched condition. I saw nothing without seeing it. I heard nothing without hearing it. I felt nothing without feeling it. It looked from every star. It smiled in every calm, breathed in every wind, and moved in every storm. On to paragraph 11. I often found myself regretting my own existence and wishing myself dead. We think about the Hamlet to be or not to be speech as it relates to this. Douglas, knowing well later in his life, once he learned to read, to appreciate the lines of Shakespeare's Hamlet. And but for the hope of being free, I have no doubt but that I should have killed myself or done something for which I should have been killed. You'll maybe remember our conversation with Emily Dickinson, Hope is the Thing with Feathers. That, go back and take a look at that set of lines. It's a beautifully poetic statement of exactly what Douglas is talking about here. While in this state of mind, he says, I was eager to hear anyone speak of slavery. I was a ready listener. Every little while I could hear something about the abolitionists, he says. And it's at that point that he begins to hear about abolition. Let's talk now, paragraphs 11 and 12. He says, I began to hear about abolition and learned from the newspaper what it meant. I also learned from two dock workers that slaves could run away to the north where they would be free. And then he says it. I resolved to do so when the chance arose, and in the meantime to teach myself to write. So notice, again, going back to validate the very thing that we said in the beginning of these lectures. You want to be a good writer? Learn how to be a good reader. What's it mean to be a good reader? Read at multiple levels. And once you realize the way in which great writers are able to produce good writing at multiple levels, you, through your reading, will become a great writer. And it will be for Douglas then this intention to become a great writer. He said, now how did he learn how to write? Fascinating question. I did this by copying the letters I saw carpenters write in the shipyard and then telling boys who could write that I could do it too. To prove me false, they would write more than I could. So I learned the letters they wrote. Go back to our comments in the freshman folder on Twain's Tom Sawyer and his reverse psychology as it relates, you'll remember this, right? As it relates to painting of the fence. He uses some brilliant reverse psychology to find a way to get educated. Put it in your notes. Douglass was willing to do whatever it took. By any means necessary will be how Malcolm X will talk about it years later, as he thinks about the significance of what Douglass went through. He says, I copied from Master Thomas's copybooks as well. In other words, whatever it took for me to be able to gain this knowledge, I was willing to do it. In other words, notice Douglass, not waiting for someone to give him information. He went for that information as best as he could. Wow, what a great role model. I argue it, and we've been doing it in 303 for a long time. We gotta remember the great Frederick Douglass when we start to think about school and education and why it matters that we take this so seriously. Paragraphs 13 through 17 are disheartening, but we're forced to have to accept some of the important lessons. He tells us that when my old master died, his estate had to be divided between his children as part of the quote-unquote property. I had to return to the plantation. People and animals alike were grouped together, examined in the same callous way, assigned a particular value, divided between Andrew and Lestrita. We were all terrified of being sent with Master Andrew, whose cruelty I witnessed firsthand when he savagely beat my little brother in front of me. In the end, I was sent back to Baltimore and the Olds, who were as glad to see me as I was them. This gives Douglass the opportunity to speak about plantation life and the horrors of plantation life. The last paragraphs, 18 through 19. My grandmother's fate